Now, let's go ahead and talk about decision errors. In hypothesis testing, we have the type 1 and the type 2 errors. Let's remind ourselves what we're doing in hypothesis testing. In hypothesis testing, we examine evidence in the form of a sample data to decide if we have enough evidence to make a decision. One of the decisions could be to reject the null hypothesis. So if we reject the null hypothesis, then we're saying that the sample information favors the alternative hypothesis. That means we go in favor of the alternative hypothesis. So that's one decision that we might make. Now, the other option would be to fail to reject the null hypothesis. If we fail to reject the null hypothesis, then we're saying that the sample information is insufficient to go in favor of the alternative hypothesis. In other words, we're saying our sample does not provide enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. We cannot go in favor of the alternative hypothesis. When you're making a decision for hypothesis testing, you're either rejecting the null hypothesis or failing to reject the null hypothesis. So now let's go ahead and talk about the decision errors that can occur. When you perform a hypothesis test, there are 4 possible outcomes. And here we have a table that summarizes the outcomes. So one outcome could be that you decide to reject the null hypothesis. However, the null hypothesis was true. This is known as a type 1 error. Okay? So that is known as a type 1 error. Now, if you decide to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false, then you made the correct decision. You were supposed to reject the null hypothesis. Another outcome could be that you decide to not reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true, which is the correct decision to make, right? If the null hypothesis is true, then we should not reject the null hypothesis. Now, the last outcome could be that you decide not to reject the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is false. This is known as the type 2 error. Again, this would be the case where the null hypothesis is false and you failed to reject the null hypothesis. You didn't reject. Now, in general, in most situations, the type of error that has the greatest consequences is the type 1 error. So be careful. Do not make a type 1 error. Imagine that there's established claim about the population. Somebody claims that they studied the whole population, that they've been studying the whole population for years, and they have a parameter for that population. Then you come and you reject that claim, when in fact the claim is true. I will be showing you an example that makes you reflect on the type 1 error and the type 2 error for a real life scenario. And that's going to help you see which error has greater consequences. But I'm just going to give you that warning. Be careful with rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. Now we have a probability for each type of error. The probability of a type 1 error is represented by alpha. The probability of a type 2 error is represented by the Greek letter beta. Now, you're not going to be finding probabilities here. You're not going to be finding alpha and beta. I'm just mentioning the notation that we use to denote the probability of these errors. And so, as I mentioned before, we want to be very careful with not making a type 1 error. So, in hypothesis testing, we're going to be dealing with the value alpha, the probability of a type 1 error. In hypothesis testing, alpha is what we call the significance level. And I'm going to make a note here. The value of alpha is going to be given to you. For example, if I tell you, perform a hypothesis test with alpha equal to 0.05. 0.05 is equivalent to 5%. You can think of this as the level of risk I'm willing to make when it comes to making a type 1 error. Okay? And usually we let that level, the significance level, be really small. So the most common value for alpha is going to be 0.05. Now, if I'm really scared, if I know that there's big consequences of making a type 1 error, for example, what if I get a lawsuit by a company? If I reject their claim about the population when the claim of the population is true, if that is the case, then I'm going to say, let's make alpha be smaller. Let alpha be maybe 0.01 or 0.001. So in this case, the level of risk that I'm willing to make of committing a type 1 error is going to be set to be really small. So again, you're not going to be finding alpha. Alpha is going to be given to you. So, I see a remark here. it went on to the next page. In this class, the value of alpha is always going to be given to you in the problem. If the alpha value is not given to you, then you're going to use alpha equal to 0.05. This is a big remark that we need to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to let you do this problem on your own. You're going to write a sentence describing the type 1 error and the type 2 error for the example that we had seen before, the example where we're looking at the XJ35 batteries. Then you're going to decide which error has bigger consequences. So go ahead and think about those questions. Go ahead and answer them on your own.